welcome to each and every one of you, and a huge thank you to New York University Abu Dhabi, and especially the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute for sponsoring and supporting this public event and the related conference. I'm going to be very brief. I'll take just a couple of moments to place this event in the context of this conference that Phil referred to, how migration makes meaning, slavery and abolition in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds, which is in progress at NYU Abu Dhabi as we speak. In the largest sense, the conference seeks to contextualize the national histories we write, the cultures that shape us, the bodies of knowledge that we produce within the framework of all sorts of migrations, in order to fully appreciate the ingredients in the food that we eat, the music that we make, the political economies that we forge. We have to take account of movement and mixing across nation states and regions. We have to ask, how are peoples, practices, politics, ideas, cultures, sometimes traumatized, but often transformed, reinvented, renewed in transit, in motion from one place to another? And oceans, of course, are critical arenas in promoting migration, encounter, and exchange. And we thank our colleagues who have come here from near and far. Special shout out to our history colleagues at NYU Abu Dhabi, as well as our literature colleagues for giving us all kinds of support. Thank you so much. At this point, I'd like for Awam to introduce our very distinguished guests who have addressed the themes of the conference from various artistic and disciplinary perspectives.
Thank you so much, and good evening. Thank you for coming to this event. We're so honored to have two people whose works actually influenced the process of conceptualizing this conference. And we were so lucky that when we asked them, could you come? And they readily said yes. So it really means a lot to us that both Carol Phillips and Shugata Bose actually agreed to come to share their time with us, as well as the wonderful colleagues from far and wide we've been talking to. Carol Phillips was born in the Caribbean island of St. Kitts, grew up in Leeds and other parts of England, and became what people generally want to call him a famous Black British writer. He's an American, but he is really a writer of the African diaspora. We've been friends for a long time, and we've encountered each other in different continents around the world as we travel seeking ways of engaging with places and spaces. He's written many majestic works, many of which have been shortlisted for various awards. He's also written screenplays for feature, particularly an adaptation of V.S. Naipaul's The Mystic Masseuse. Also wrote documentaries and other film scripts, but he's also well known for his novels and his non-fictional works, which actually try to articulate the broad subject of how the Atlantic Ocean frames his thinking, his imagination, and which he engages his audiences with. Amongst his books, so I actually forgot to skip. So amongst his books, Crossing the River, Cambridge, A Distant Shore, just so many that all you need to do is just Google and you see so many books that Kaz has written, and he's also a frequent contributor to newspapers and magazines. His work has been translated into over 12 languages. But Carol Phillips is also a professor of literature in the Department of English at Yale University. Shugata Bose is the Gardner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard University. Is a scholar of South Asia. In 2006, he published a highly acclaimed interdisciplinary work, 100 Horizons, a book which Gunja and I kept reading again and again for the elegance of its style, for the depth and provocative methods with which he approaches historical inquiry. And we also had to read a broad section of works that he had actually produced over the years, both as an individual as well as collectively with other scholars and partners. In his 100 Horizons, he conceived of the Indian Ocean as an interregional space that retained some of its organic unity even after the establishment of European colonialism in the later half of the 18th century. He's, like Carol Phillips, he's won several awards, numerous to mention here, but what you probably want to do is to hear them rather than me. So I'd rather invite both of them to come onto the podium. Shugara, Kara.
Good evening, and thank you, Awam and Gunja, and everybody at the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. And I think I should also say thank you to the participants in the conference for the papers that they've read so far and the discussions. It's been a long day for those of us who've been at the conference. I'm going to be relatively brief so we can get to some discussion. And I'm going to divide what I have to say into two parts, a non-fiction part and a fiction part. First of all, the non-fiction part. Thinking about the Atlantic world made me think immediately about the fact that I was 4 months old when I first crossed the Atlantic on a banana boat coming from the Caribbean to England. Of course, I don't remember anything about the journey as hand luggage in my mother's arms. But it's a journey that's haunted me, partly because I don't remember anything about it, and the consequences of that journey obviously had a huge and continue to have a profound influence on my life. My mother was 20 and my father was 25. And over the years I've asked them, I'm very lucky they're both still with us, I've asked them about that journey, but like many migrants, they find it difficult to talk to, in this instance, their child, but I have siblings, so I should say they find it difficult to talk to their children about the nature of the sacrifice that they made crossing the Atlantic and reshaping their life. As a consequence, growing up, I became very obsessed with the Atlantic, very obsessed with what it meant to cross that water. Of course, the difficulties of growing up in Britain in the 60s and the early 70s as a non-white child informed the urgency of the speculation about what life might have been if we hadn't have crossed the Atlantic. I read a lot about others who had voluntarily crossed the Atlantic. A book which is very dear to my heart is a book by Robert Louis Stevenson, who's better known as a writer of fiction, of children's fiction, but he wrote a wonderful book called The Amateur Emigrant, about sailing across the Atlantic to America to his sweetheart. So journeys across the Atlantic in either direction voluntarily to reshape and restructure one's life became very much a part of my own consciousness. And then, of course, moving to the United States and living as I did very quickly in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, visiting Ellis Island. This question of journeying to the United States or the Caribbean or Brazil or in the other direction to Europe, or from Africa to Europe, or indeed the reverse journey, continued to gnaw away at my consciousness. In 1997, I finally threw the towel in and decided I had to do something about this. So I somewhat foolishly booked a passage on a banana boat from Guadeloupe to England via Costa Rica and El Salvador and some other extremely dodgy places, where we loaded up bananas onto this boat. It was a German cargo ship with a Burmese crew, and the other passengers were two German couples who clearly hated each other, and an English couple who had no idea what they were doing on the ship, and they certainly had no idea what I was doing on the ship. And the journey took 3 weeks, but after about 2 weeks, I finally began to have what it was clear to me once I'd boarded in Guadeloupe was pretty much on the horizon. I began to have the nervous breakdown that I figured was always going to be a danger of getting on this ship. So I think the solitude with which I then began to retreat into did enable me to answer the question that my parents had never given to me, which is, what was it like? So I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs from the essay that I wrote about crossing the Atlantic on a banana boat. For almost 2 days, I managed to secrete myself so that I see nobody. This is relatively easy to do, as I continue to sleep in the day and wander the ship at night. This creates the slight difficulty of my having to sneak into the kitchen and smuggle food back to my cabin in order to eat. But this is a small price to pay for the peace of mind that solitude bestows upon me. On the second morning of my voluntary hibernation, I stand by myself at the front of the ship, and I see a pair of migrating birds skimming playfully across the water, one mimicking the other. They give me the confidence that land cannot be far off. However, I now realize that the difficulties of dealing with my fellow passengers aside, I have actually come to like the rhythm of life on the Atlantic Ocean. I want to see land. I want to go home. I definitely want to leave this banana boat, but I have a feeling that I will miss the Atlantic Ocean. An hour later, as the sun begins to rise into a cloudless sky, and as my eyes roam the horizon for more birds, I notice a school of porpoises. As they reach the ship, they begin to play, gracefully leaping and twisting, as though mocking the very idea of undertaking this passage in such a large, ugly vessel. I once asked my mother what she did when she got on the ship to England in the late 50s. She took her time in answering, and then she said that she worked out how to get to the lifeboats with me in her arms and with her eyes closed. She cannot swim, and so she needed to be sure that if there was an emergency and if the ship was plunged into darkness, she would still know how to get off the ship. I asked her about the rest of the time crossing the Atlantic. She looked blankly at me. As I continued to stare at the porpoises playing in the strong light of dawn, I now know how she and all the other emigrants felt as they crossed the Atlantic Ocean. They felt lonely. So that's non-fiction. The fictional side of things, in the mid-80s, so I guess 30 years ago, I began to write about what one might term non-voluntary migration in the Atlantic world. I began to write about the slave trade and certain elements of the slave trade. In order to do this, of course, and I'm talking about 30 years ago, I needed to do some research because there wasn't that much material that was available. I spent a lot of time in the British Library looking at old journals, looking at old slave ship captains' records. 30 years later, and I've been reminded of this for the last 2 days, there's been a tremendous amount of scholarship done in history, in film, in anthropology, in various academic disciplines, which I think has enabled people like myself who write or who would like to write about the Atlantic world in terms of fiction, in terms of reimagining it. It's made our task, I think, a lot easier. I think in many respects we stand, those of us who write novels and short stories, that's connected to the triangular trade that took place in the Atlantic world, we stand to a certain degree on a platform that has been built by much of the scholarship in the last 30 years. When I first started, I wrote to a historian. I was very nervous about wanting to get it right. I wrote to a historian called Paul Edwards, who was a professor at the University of Edinburgh. I sent him the manuscript of a novel I'd written that took place in the 18th century. And I asked him if he would read it to check it. I didn't know what to tell him to look for, but I knew that it might be wrong. I knew that there were possibly things that only a scholar would be able to spot. And he wrote back a number of suggestions, all of which were very good. The one that I always remember is I had a young English woman sitting on a settee and crossing her legs. And he said no. She would never cross her legs, not a woman of that class at that time in that period. These small details, which perhaps one might imagine don't matter, I think they do matter. And that's what I'm really trying to say about the relationship, I think, between literature of the imagination and scholarship, and historians in particular. I owe a debt to many historians, including now the late Paul Edwards. I'm going to read 2.5 pages from a novel that's going to be published in January 2015. And I was flicking through it, seeing if I could find anything that vaguely related to the title of Awam and Gunja's conference that would justify the lavish hotel and the airfare. And I found a short passage which made me wonder if 25, 30 years ago, without all the work that's been done by scholars, I might have made this not a 2.5-page section, but a 20-page section. In other words, if I might have felt the necessity to explicate, to try to do some of the work of the historian as I'm imagining, I think it's 2.5 pages because I think I'm assuming now, not just because of work that's been done in the academy, but work that's been done in popular media, film, the number of films that have been made about the slave trade, the number of TV series. Bayo was mentioning today Roots, which I know is a long time ago, but it did change. It did change a lot of things for a lot of imaginative writers. I don't think it's any secret at all that the upsurge in fictional reimagining of the period of the slave trade, and I'm thinking of novels by everybody from Charles Johnson to Toni Morrison, has happened recently because I think it has gone hand in hand with the scholarship that has been produced. But I wondered if I might, 25 or 30 years ago, have felt that I needed to say more about this one woman's journey across the Atlantic Ocean and not compress it to 2.5 pages. But I'll just read the 2.5 pages and finish there. She remembers long days in the West Indian fields, digging with a rod of pointed iron under a burning sun. She remembers restless nights as black as soot, listening for the sound of footsteps approaching the door and wondering whether tonight it will be her turn to be covered. But Master never came to her, a Congo woman, too dark. In the morning, a skillet of Indian corn or yams seasoned with peppers would be thrust into her hut, and together with the others, she would leap up and tussle for the food. Having eaten, they would commence the march, quick, quick, out to the fields for more digging and weeding of grass and gathering of stones, until one day she was hoisted onto the back of a wagon full of sickly property and carried to the town square. She mounted a wooden platform, the least of the female litter, and waited until all the others had been taken. She stood alone now, but the captain eventually nodded without enthusiasm, and her short time in the Indies reached an abrupt conclusion. On her journey to the Indies, it was the rats that had inspired the greatest fear, for they fed with conviction and grew huge and profited handsomely from their passage. The human cargo was chained and manacled in the hold, where they rolled to the left and then back to the right, their movements determined by the surging waves, but on each occasion that the vessel dipped, the cargo received the blessing of a libation of filth. Soon they were too sick to eat, and most were too grief-stricken to cry, and she lay surrounded by the doleful lamentations of those who rotted in the darkness. They whispered in plaintive tongues that made no sense to her half-chewed ears, and they composed themselves for their own private journeys. During the second voyage, she remained anchored to the splintered floor of the captain's cabin, unless he had business with her. A crude depravity marked this man's crumpled brow, and she soon discovered that her captor was fired with a passion for unconditional obedience. His brutish appetite rose and fell like the ship, and at the conclusion of his cowardly attacks, he would reshackle her and then reach for his pipe and smoke the tobacco that appeared to offer him some vestige of peace in mind and body. Moving even a little caused the chains to bite painfully at her wrists and ankles, and so she would simply curl up in the corner and watch as he began to blow plumes of smoke. She worried that the interminable crossing was making her dull, and so, trembling like a palm leaf, she tried hard to recall the simple dignity of a bowl from which one might eat, or the long-forgotten pleasure of a few breaths of clean, pure air. And then one morning, the exasperated man ushered her to the foot of a steep staircase, and then to the upper level where she experienced a change of air. He pressed a guinea into her palm, and the ship having docked in the night, he pointed to the great port of Liverpool that lay spread out before them, and turned her loose to find employment and seek shelter. It was some while before she moved off from the docks, being unsure if she was at liberty to walk abroad. And after a few hours of edging her uncertain way along bustling streets, a sharp-tongued working woman with a fine white cloud of hair came to her aid and made it her business to help this lost soul rediscover her grit and establish a new home in this clamorous town of ships and sailors. Thank you.
It's a a wonderful experience to be here in Abu Dhabi at the invitation of Gunja and Awam. I have hugely enjoyed the conference over the last 2 days and learned a great deal about Atlantic history. The only other conference that I enjoyed as much was when I had the opportunity of being with two literary figures at a conference called Oceans Connect. And on that occasion, the place of Carol Phillips was taken by none other than Derek Walcott. And the high point of that conference was my ability to go and have a copy of Omeros signed by Walcott. And I still use that copy when I teach my course at Harvard on the Indian Ocean in comparative perspective. The other literary figure who was present on that occasion was Orhan Pamuk, reading from some of his early work on the Mediterranean. I should tell Cass that I've actually done the Atlantic crossing, and I remember nothing of it. I was 3 years old. My father had gone as a Rockefeller Fellow to the Harvard Medical School and worked in the Children's Hospital for a year and a half. And when I was about 3 years old, we traveled back across the Atlantic from New York to Southampton. But I have, of course, traveled later by sea in the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea. As Awam told you while he was introducing me, I wrote a book titled 100 Horizons a number of years ago. It was published in 2006. And in it, I made a case for the relevance and resilience of an interregional space in modern times. There have been many great historians of the Indian Ocean who have written about the millennium from the rise of Islam to about the 18th century. But most of them had come to the conclusion that with the onset of Western imperial domination, the organic unity of the Indian Ocean world was sundered. It was just ripped apart. And when I started my work on the 19th and 20th centuries, I felt that, yes, something major did happen at the end of the 18th century and in the early 19th, but the old links were reordered. And I felt that one could not really offer an interpretation of even Britain's colonial empire by limiting the analysis to the territorial landmass of the South Asian subcontinent. One had to actually explore the links that were forged with neighboring regions across both the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea. In my earlier incarnation, I was very much an economic historian. So even in that book, 100 Horizons, I tried to bring together the aspects of political economy and culture. But you know, there is a chapter where I talk about flows of capitalists and laborers. And certainly if you think about capitalists, particularly intermediary capitalists, and there were Chinese and Indian and Baghdadi Jewish capitalists, for them, the Indian Ocean was the sea in which they operated, from the East African coast to the South China Sea, or from Zanzibar to Singapore. And there was always glass ceiling to the capitalist architecture up to the middle of the 20th century. So none of them, excepting one family, the Sassoons, none of them, excepting the Sassoons, was able to break into the world of high finance in European capitals. When it came to labor migration, of course, the challenge was rather more difficult because, yes, of course, with the formal end of slavery and the slave trade, indentured laborers moved in very large numbers to Indian Ocean locations. There were indentured laborers, other colonially regulated sort of laborers who traveled from India to Mauritius. 455,000 indentured laborers traveled to Mauritius between the 1830s and the 1870s, and to South Africa, to Queensland, but there were Tamil rubber plantation workers who went to Malaya and so forth. And yet, of course, this labor migration had a global scope. Many Indian laborers went to the Atlantic to work on the sugar plantations in the Caribbean or to the Pacific, to Fiji. And there I had to make an argument that there was still something distinctive about the Indian Ocean interregional space, and it couldn't just be folded into a seamless global history. And there were certain kinship patterns, forms of recruitment that were special, and also the circular quality of Indian migration was naturally much greater in the Indian Ocean zone than in the world as a whole. But in addition to the flows of capitalists and laborers, I did want to talk a little bit about two very different visions of unity of the Indian Ocean world. And that's what I'll sort of read from. There is, of course, the Curzonian vision, which emphasizes the strategic unity of the Indian Ocean world. And then there is the Tagorean vision, which imagines the Indian Ocean as a shared cultural ecumene. So let me begin with Curzon. On 3rd November 1903, Lord George Nathaniel Curzon, Viceroy of India, led a flag-waving naval flotilla out of Karachi harbour into the Western Indian Ocean. The relative positions of the ships were so admirably maintained that the lights of the squadron, as seen by the night, presented an apparently stationary pageant. The coast of Oman was sighted just after sunrise on 18th November, an apparently unbroken line of precipitous cliffs rising diaphanous and opalescent out of the pale blue waters of the Indian Ocean. Addressing the sheikhs of Trucial Oman in a darbar or courtroom fitted up and decked with gold-worked carpets and handsome embroideries, on board the Argonaut, on 21st November 1903, Curzon explained why Great Britain sought dominance in this region. The history of your states and of your families and the present condition of the Gulf are the answer. We found strife and we have created order. The great empire of India, which it is our duty to defend, lies almost at your gates. We are not now going to throw away this century of costly and triumphant enterprise. We shall not wipe out the most unselfish page in history. The peace of these waters must still be maintained. Your independence will continue to be upheld, and the influence of the British government must remain supreme. Now, in Curzon's imperious public rhetoric, the sovereign independence of the Gulf sheikdoms and the supreme influence of the British sovereign had been neatly placed on two sides of the same coin. On 18th and 19th November, the Viceroy had met the Sultan of Muscat, whose demeanour he had been pleased to report privately to His Majesty's government was, quote, that of a loyal feudatory of the British Crown rather than of an independent sovereign, unquote. It was observed at Bahrain on 26th November that the Sheikh had kept his sandals on throughout the interview with the Viceroy, but the indiscretion was forgiven, as his omission to remove them was evidently due to nervousness. On 28th November, the Viceroy of India landed in Kuwait. He was delighted with the great reception he received from the Sheikh and his forces, cavalry, camel cavalry, and foot. Surrounded by a shouting, galloping crowd, firing guns with ball cartridge into the air or into the ground, the Viceroy and Sheikh made their state entry into the town. The sole vehicle of Kuwait, which they rode, was later in the day kicked to pieces by the two Arab horses who drew it. But the visit on 28th and 29th November to Kuwait, which had been made a British protectorate in 1899, was reported by Curzon to have been regarded by the ruler as finally setting the seal upon the protection and overlordship of the British power. The success and completeness of the Viceroy's tour, J.G. Lorimer tells us, were to some extent marred by a diplomatic incident at Bushehr, where the Iranian authorities refused to be reduced to the status of the Sultan of Muscat. Unable to get his way on the definition of sovereignty and the corresponding protocol, Curzon abandoned plans of disembarking at the Iranian port. Now, the Tagorean vision of the Indian Ocean was a very different one, as you can imagine, And I have written at length about Tagore's sea voyage to Southeast Asia in 1927. He traveled on a French ship called the Amboise, and as he was traveling through the Bay of Bengal, he wrote in a letter home that they had embarked on this pilgrimage, Tirtha Jatra was the Bengali word used, to see the signs of India's entry into the universal. And I used Tagore's Java Jatri Potro, letters of a traveler to Java, but also the linguist Shuniti Kumar Chattopadhyay's book, Deepamoy Bharat, Island India, in which he gave a vivid day-to-day account of what was going on the deck of the ship and at the various ports and so on. But what I will read for you now is a description of Tagore's journey to the same parts that Curzon had traveled to. So here it is. Malaya and Java were great Muslim societies under European colonial subjugation. It was his desire to see Muslim countries with Muslim sovereigns that led Tagore to board a Dutch aeroplane to travel to Iran and Iraq in April 1932. There was one other rather mercenary motive. He wanted to collect some money for a chair in Persian from the Shah of Iran. Not only was Tagore too old and infirm by this time to stand the long journey by sea, but a new mode of transportation was already beginning to revolutionize travel in the Indian Ocean arena. The Persian Gulf was now, as the British political resident in Bushehr put it, the Suez Canal of the air. This was Tagore's second journey by air, the earlier one being from London to Paris. On that occasion, he had only felt a loose tie to the land, but his heart felt a wrench as the plane lifted off from the soil of Bengal. The aeroplane roared its way towards the west, touching down at Allahabad, Jodhpur, and Karachi. The Jahaj, or Jahaz, ship, and in Indian languages, it's the same word for aeroplane and ship. The ship flew along the ocean's shore, blue water on the left, hilly desert to the right. After one more stop at Jask on the Makran coast, the poet and his companions landed in Bushehr. Tagore was as welcome there as Curzon had not been in 1903. He was, in fact, treated as royalty. In Iran, Tagore was not just any poet, but a poet of the East. For the Persians, he wrote, "My identity has another special feature. I'm Indo-Aryan, I have a blood relationship with them." Governor Farooqi of Bushehr certainly claimed in his welcome address that the Aryan race and Aryan civilization formed the basis of the bond between India and Iran. But word had also spread that Tagore had certain affinities with the romantic and devotional Persian poets, and it was the brotherhood of Sufi poets which eventually turned out to be the more emotionally charged aspect of the relationship. European race theory took second place to Indo-Persian poetry as the ground for commonality. Shades of Aryanism were drowned in the depths of Sufism. With his main identity established as a poet and an honorary Sufi, the highlight of his visit turned out to be the encounter with Saadi and Hafiz in Shiraz. Tagore had made Hafiz's acquaintance as a boy through his father's translations from the Persian. Hafiz had also been the favorite of the great Bengali social reformer of the early 19th century, Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Overwhelmed by an effusive welcoming address with references to Saadi's soul wafting in the air and Hafiz's satisfied smile being reflected in the joy of his countrymen, Tagore pointed out that the only weight on his side of the scale was that he was present in Iran in person. Hafiz had received an invitation in the 14th century from Ghiyasuddin Azam Shah, the third Ilyas Shahi Sultan of Bengal, but if Persian traditions are to be believed, his ship had been forced to turn back because of a storm. Bengalis generally believed that Hafiz responded to the Ilyas Shahi invitation with a poem about Bengalis having taken to appreciating sugar now that they had tasted it in the form of Hafiz's poetry. At a reception in a carpeted garden surrounding Saadi's grave, Tagore claimed to be akin to the Sufi poets and composers of yesteryears. It is just that he used the language of the modern age. At Hafiz's graveside, the custodian of the cemetery brought out a large square volume of Hafiz's Diwan and asked Tagore to open it with a wish, and his eyes shut. The poet had been agonizing about the blindness and prejudice that went by the name of religion, and wanted India to be free of this terrible affliction. "Will the tavern's door be flung open?" Tagore read when he opened his eyes, "and with it the tangled knots of life unfasten? Even if vain religious bigots keep it shut, have faith that by God's will the door will open." Now, religious bigots is a very inadequate translation of the Persian phrase Zahir-e-Khutbin, somebody who appears to be religious but actually is not truly spiritual or religious. And also when Tagore translated the lines into Bengali, he turned tavern's door into heaven's door, Shorgodar. But then, of course, we know there's hardly any difference between tavern and heaven, at least in a poetic sense. So Tagore felt that Hafiz and he were long-lost friends who had in the same tavern or heaven together filled many cups of wine. Now, Tagore, of course, traveled in other parts of Iran, and in the end, once he reached Tehran, he summed up his Persian sojourn in these words: "Each country of Asia will solve its own historical problems according to its strength, nature, and need, but the lamp that they will each carry on their path to progress will converge to illuminate the common ray of knowledge. It is only when the light of the spirit glows that the bond of humanity becomes true." The journey to the Iraqi border took Tagore through Kasbin, Hamadan, Kirmanshah, Behestun, and Takibustan. From his hotel room in Baghdad, Tagore could see the wooden bridge over the Tigris built by General Stanley Maude, which the 28th Punjabis, 53rd Sikhs, 67th Punjabis, and the 2nd and 4th Gurkhas had crossed in March 1917. A conversation with the Christian chaplain attached to the British Air Force in Iraq, which was then engaged in a ferocious bombing campaign against Iraqi villagers, led Tagore to reflect on the shift from sea power to air power in human history. He could see that it was extremely easy to kill the desert dwellers from the air. The humanity of those who could be killed from afar with impunity was not especially apparent to the killers, who were not at serious risk of facing retaliation. When the priest affiliated with the Iraqi Air Force asked him for a message, Tagore wrote, "From the beginning of our days, man has imagined the seat of divinity in the upper air, from which comes light and blows the breath of life for all creatures on this earth. The peace of its dawn, the splendor of its sunset, the voice of eternity in its starry silence have inspired countless generations of men with an ineffable presence of the infinite, urging their minds away from the sordid interests of daily life. If in an evil moment man's cruel history should spread its black wings to invade that land of divine dreams with its cannibalistic greed and fratricidal ferocity, then God's curse will certainly descend upon us for that hideous desecration, and the last curtain will be rung down upon the world of man, for whom God feels ashamed." One day in Iraq, he indulged his childhood fancy by visiting a Bedouin tent. He was first served coffee, thick, bitter, black coffee. Then followed a gargantuan meal to the accompaniment of delicate music. Tagore and his male companions were deprived of the pleasure of watching a dance by the Bedouin women, which only Tagore's daughter-in-law could enjoy and later report on. But he was treated to a war dance by the men, with whirling sticks, knives, guns, and swords. Tagore was just reflecting on how different his life, nurtured by the rivers of Bengal, was from the struggle for existence in the desert, when the Bedouin chief startled him with the language of universal humanity. "Our Prophet has taught us," the chief said, "that he is a true Muslim, from whom no fellow human being fears any harm." How should we interpret Tagore's intellectual journeys across seas? Some tend to hear voices from the colonial world in their unbending insistence on claims to difference. Yet Tagore was a proponent, an eloquent proponent, of a universalist aspiration, albeit a universalism with a difference. Universalist claims from Europe in the modern age have rarely managed to avoid the taint of imperialism, which in turn led local cultures under siege to assert their difference. A discerning historical investigation makes clear, however, that universalism was hardly a quest on which European modernity had any kind of monopoly. Local, regional, and national cultures in the Indian Ocean world were not just jealous guardians of their own distinctiveness, but also wished to participate in and contribute to larger cosmopolitan thought zones, larger arenas of cultural exchange. A certain sense of nostalgia for the bonds of the past need not be seen as a simple longing for a pre-colonial refuge in the hostile environment of the colonial world. It was very much a struggle in the present to try and influence the shape of a global future. The ideas that wafted across the Indian Ocean and beyond suggest that the age of empire may best be studied in the framework of multiple and competing universalisms, rather than mutually exclusive and inherently conflictual cultural relativisms. In late May 1932, the intellectuals of Baghdad organized a civic reception in Tagore's honor. An old poet recited his poetry in a sonorous voice which sounded to Tagore like tumultuous waves on the ocean. Once the flow of Arabic poetry had ebbed, Tagore spoke about Hindu-Muslim conflict in India. He invited his hosts to resend their message with its universalist ideal in the sacred name of their prophet once more across the Arabian Sea, so that India could be saved from communitarian narrow-mindedness, inhuman intolerance, and the degradation of liberal religion, and put on the high road to unity and freedom. He expressed this sentiment even better in a poem painting signed Baghdad, May 24th, 1932. It can be read today as an exhortation to people across the globe to awaken from their postmodern slumber and weave together communities and fragments into a larger and more generous pattern of human history. The night has ended. Put out the light of the lamp of thine own narrow corner, smudged with smoke. Put out the light of the lamp of thine own narrow corner, smudged with smoke. The great morning which is for all appears in the east. Let its light reveal us to each other who walk on the same path of pilgrimage. Thank you.
Thanks for the beautiful speeches. I'm interested in historical consciousness, and I would be glad if I can receive some comments from Professor Phillips. I guess historical consciousness can be defined as individual and collective understanding of the past. And we understand the past through the works of historians, scholars, and researchers. How about novels and essays and plays? What do you think as a professor of English and as a novelist? Do you think these novels and essays, they form a source for historical consciousness? Thanks.
Well, thank you. I hope so. I hope so. I mean, it's my business as a writer is with the human heart. And unlike historians who have to get things right, who do research, I actually don't have to get things right, because most of the time I'm fumbling in the dark. When my students ask me what is writing, I say it's fumbling in the dark. And what you're trying to do is construct something. You're trying to put something together. You're being very intuitive. Scholarship doesn't really work on mere intuition. Intuition is obviously a part of it, but there's a word that is bandied around often in scholarly circles, which is called deconstruction. Taking things apart, seeing how they work, putting them together. So I think that, you know, a novel which is set in a historical period can help you to understand that period, but that's not the primary job of the novel. The primary job of the novel is to help you understand the heart of the people, the pain, the anxiety, the difficulties which ensnare the lives of the people in the novel. We don't read Dr. Zhivago to find out about the Russian Revolution. We find out about the Russian Revolution en route to reading Dr. Zhivago. But what we really remember at the end is Lara and Dr. Zhivago. One could say the same about, we don't read Dickens to find out about the condition of the working class in Victorian England. But we do find out about it en route to understanding Oliver Twist and David Copperfield. So I think there's, you know, it can help you to understand the past, and it can certainly enhance your understanding of the past, but that's certainly not what's in my mind when I'm sitting down to fumble in the dark.
Professor Bose, I just have one question for you. Why do you think it is that one notion of one kind of universalism triumphs over the other in historical terms? Why is it that the colonial enterprise and the universalism based on that is able to effectively, not subjugate, but coexist with the peace and harmony and the mystical universalism that's propounded by Tagore and the like? Number one. And number two, don't you think that the whole notion of world history as an intellectual enterprise is inextricably linked to the colonial project, or to the project of empire, with Hegel being its main proponent, having existed at the same time as the empire was beginning to get off the ground? If that is relevant.
Now, was, you know, one form of universalism, the universalism that emanated from the European Enlightenment, was it truly dominant? I mean, if one thinks of Ranajit Guha and his phrase, dominance without hegemony, you know, it never actually exercised a kind of hegemony in the intellectual and cultural sphere. It was always contested by, you know, alternative universalist aspirations. And again, you know, related to that, if one considers your sort of second question, you know, there is no reason why, you know, the project of world history should necessarily be tainted by the power of European empires. And once again, you know, Ranajit Guha, the great subaltern historian, has a wonderful little book on history at the limits of world history. Yes, and so having said that, I am actually somewhat critical of the way in which world history and global history is being, you know, practiced within the academy at this moment. There are very sophisticated versions of this kind of world history or global history, but I think there is a danger of producing a narrative about uniformity, you know, across the globe. And to some extent, my work, including my book, 100 Horizons, was at one level a contribution to global history, but at another, it was a, you know, cautionary tale about some of the excesses of you know, global history. I felt that there were certain webs of human relationships that were strung together at a much tighter level, you know, in the interregional arena of the Indian Ocean, rather than on a global scale. And there is a great danger of missing out on those kinds of connections and links and flows by simply, you know, writing global history. Now, this is not to say that these ties were not vulnerable in the modern period to major crises at the center of a capitalist world economy. Certainly when the Depression struck, many of the finely tuned relationships that had been constructed at the interregional level were in fact torn apart. So I think we need a more sophisticated view. And if I may add one word to the, of a reply to a previous question, we are now actually expanding our definition of history and also what we consider to be our archive. And that, you know, and we don't accept anymore a definition of history that was crafted in the European sort of academy and in the universities around 1870. We are now beginning to ferret out historical consciousness from a whole range of chronicles and ballads and epic poems written in a whole plethora of regional sort of languages. And this has been best done by historians of a young generation who have been probing regional identities both inside India and also crossing the outer boundaries of India across the Indian Ocean.
When Curzon talked about maintaining the independence of the crucial sheikdoms, and at the same time talked about maintaining dominant position for the British Empire, was he being insincere, or did he really truly believe that?
What was going on at that time was a sea change in the definition of sovereignty. If you look at the early modern period in Indian Ocean history, there was a conception of what I have described as layered and shared sovereignty. If you think about the Mughal Empire, the emperor or the Shahenshah was a king at the center of a circle of kings. He would simply claim the highest manifestation of sovereignty. There could be many other sovereigns at other layers of the polity. But from the latter half of the 19th century, particularly after the Crown took over India from the Company, there was what was imported from Europe was a unitary conception of sovereignty. And so in the directly ruled territories or provinces of British India, there could now only be one sovereign over any particular piece of territory. However, the British did not actually control all of the land mass of the subcontinent. The directly ruled territories consisted of about 2/3, and about 1/3 of the territory consisted of princely states, big and small. And these Gulf sheikdoms, or some of the Malay sultanates, are to some degree comparable to these princely states. So I think that there was something of a fake version of sovereignty that got attached to these princely rulers, some of these sheikdoms in the Middle East, some of the sultanates in Southeast Asia. So I would not be so blunt as to say that Curzon was being deliberately devious, but he was very much a part of authoring these new definitions of sovereignty. One very unitary and monolithic, and the other talking about sovereignty, but not really acknowledging substantive sovereignty of rulers at lower levels of the polity. And also the idea of frontiers changed. Curzon wrote extensively on frontiers and borders. Borders were hardly ever rigidly drawn in the form of lines in the age before modernity. But now frontiers, borders also came to be conceptualized in a very different manner as new conceptions of sovereignty took hold.
Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. And I know you both have to catch your flights tonight and at different times. But I really want to also thank the audience and our colleagues who have been meeting and sharing ideas with us in the last couple of days. The conference continues tomorrow, but we'll really, really thank both of you for honoring us with your presence. Thank you so much.